Hello and welcome to this video on the 1970 energy crisis. In the early 1970s, the world was shaken by a sudden and significant increase in oil prices. This event, which is known as the 1970 energy crisis, had far-reaching consequences that continue to shape our energy policy and the global economy to this day. In this video, we will explore the causes and effects of this crisis and discuss the lessons we can learn from it. During the early 1970s, the consumption of oil in the United States, particularly in the form of gasoline, was on the rise. However, domestic oil production was declining, which resulted in an increased dependence on oil imported from other countries. Despite this situation, Americans were not overly concerned about a potential shortage or price increase in oil. This mindset was reinforced by policymakers in Washington, who believed that Arab oil exporters could not afford to lose revenue from the U.S. market. However, in 1973, this confidence was shattered when OPEC, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, imposed an oil embargo, causing fuel shortages and extremely high prices throughout much of the decade. Background to the 1970s energy crisis. In 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel in British-controlled Palestine, intended as a homeland for Jews, resulted in a conflict between the Arab population and the new Israeli state. This tension escalated into full-scale wars over the next few decades, including the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when Egypt and Syria attacked Israel on a Jewish holy day. The Soviet Union provided military aid to Egypt and Syria, prompting US President Richard Nixon to support Israel by sending supplies. However, members of OPEC responded by reducing their oil production and imposing an embargo on oil shipments to the US and the Netherlands, which were seen as supporters of Israel. Although the war ended in late October, the embargo and production limitations remained, causing a worldwide energy crisis. Contrary to earlier assumptions, the boycott did not hurt the Persian Gulf economically, as the increased price per barrel of oil more than compensated for the reduced production. Energy crisis. Effects in the United States and abroad. Following the announcement of the embargo, the price of oil skyrocketed from $3 to $12 per barrel within just 3 months. This sudden spike in prices and the resulting fuel shortages were a significant shift from the decades of abundant supply and growing demand that Americans had become accustomed to. Long lines formed at gas stations across the country, prompting leaders at the local, state, and national levels to call for conservation measures, such as closing gas stations on Sundays and asking homeowners to refrain from using holiday lights. The energy crisis also dealt a major blow to the American automotive industry, which had been producing larger cars for years and was now outcompeted by Japanese manufacturers producing smaller and more fuel-efficient models. While the embargo was not enforced evenly in Europe, the resulting price hikes led to an even greater energy crisis than in the US. Countries such as Great Britain, Germany, Switzerland, Norway, and Denmark implemented restrictions on driving, boating, and flying. In the UK, the Prime Minister urged citizens to heat only one room during the winter. Energy crisis. Lasting impact. Even after the oil embargo was lifted in March 1974, the impact of the energy crisis continued to be felt throughout the decade, with high oil prices persisting. In response, the U.S. government implemented measures such as price controls, gasoline rationing, a national speed limit, and year-round daylight saving time in 1974-75. The crisis also led to a surge in environmentalism, which became a key driver of policymaking in Washington during the 1970s. To address the need for energy reform, legislation was passed to reduce America's dependence on fossil fuels and increase domestic oil production, as well as explore alternative energy sources such as solar, wind, and nuclear power. The Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act, passed by Congress in November 1973, was one such legislation, along with the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975 and the establishment of the Department of Energy in 1977. However, progress towards energy efficiency and reducing dependence on foreign oil slowed as oil prices dropped to more reasonable levels in the mid-1980s. Domestic oil production declined once again, while imports of foreign oil increased, despite earlier efforts to reduce dependence on it. The crisis unfolds. The 1970 energy crisis had a significant impact on the global economy. In addition to the oil embargo, OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, also decided to raise oil prices. These actions led to a sharp increase in oil prices and caused inflation and economic recession in many countries around the world. The crisis also had geopolitical consequences, as some countries became more dependent on the countries that were able to supply oil. The crisis continued until 1974, when the embargo was lifted, but the effects of the crisis continued to be felt for years to come. The consequences of the crisis. The short-term consequences of the 1970 energy crisis were severe and far-reaching. They included a significant increase in oil prices, inflation, and economic recession. The crisis also exposed the vulnerability of countries that were heavily reliant on oil imports. However, in the long term, the crisis also had several positive consequences. It led to increased investment in alternative energy sources, such as nuclear and solar power, and a renewed focus on energy efficiency. It also prompted countries to explore the potential of new oil reserves, particularly in the North Sea and Alaska. The lessons learned. The 1970 energy crisis taught us many valuable lessons about the importance of energy security, the need for diversification in energy sources, and the dangers of relying too heavily on any one source of energy. It also highlighted the geopolitical implications of energy dependence and the importance of international cooperation in managing energy resources. The crisis led to the development of strategic petroleum reserves in many countries, which are now used to mitigate the impact of future supply disruptions. The lessons learned from the 1970 energy crisis continue to shape energy policy today, as countries seek to ensure greater energy security and transition to more sustainable energy sources. Thank you for watching this video on the 1970 energy crisis. We hope you found it informative and educational. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below and we'll do our best to respond. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this one. And as always, stay curious and keep learning.